Under this current administration, in a mere 3 years, power rates have increased by 25%. Madam Speaker, that is a rate that is unsustainable in Nova Scotia and clearly has to be reined in. So what exactly have we said? We said that we want to see fairness to electricity prices. And we've presented 5 possible solutions for Nova Scotians to consider. First, we've said, break Nova Scotia Power's monopoly and allow renewable energy producers to sell directly to you, the consumer. Madam Speaker, I'm not sure if you were there at the time, 2005, but there was a report that was made for the previous Conservative government that suggested the exact same thing. It was a report that came, I believe, was a professor from Dalhousie University, Bob Fournier, if I'm not mistaken, I believe, is one who wrote the Electricity Marketplace Governance Report. And he made that recommendation. The previous government was convinced by Nova Scotia Power not to move forward on it, and somehow this government has been convinced by Nova Scotia Power not to move forward on it. But I think Nova Scotians want to see whether that is viable, whether it can be done, and they want to have that discussion take place, and we certainly recommend that. We've also said, and I'll save this one for last, we've also indicated that we don't believe that Nova Scotians, the ratepayers, should have to pay for bonuses at Nova Scotia Power. Madam Speaker, when you have a monopoly that has the UARB that sets a rate and a guaranteed rate of return, where rates are increasing almost every year, and you want to reward your executive with bonuses by the ratepayers, where have the ratepayers benefited under that scenario? So finally, the government has heard the concerns raised by our caucus and is looking to put an end to that. We've also indicated that there needs to be a review of the rate of return. We've seen the Premier in this House defend the rate of return given to Nova Scotia Power, saying he thought it was more than reasonable. I don't think many Nova Scotians consider it to be reasonable at all. While Nova Scotians have seen their pensions, their investments take significant hits on the market, they continue to see Nova Scotia Power enjoyed a guaranteed rate of return, which is over 9%. As well, we have asked for a value for money audit. Now, Madam Speaker, I was here in the House, you were here in the House to hear the Premier dismiss that notion. The Minister of Energy dismissed that notion. They said it was ridiculous for the Liberals to suggest that that was already being done. There's no need to do it again. Yet here in the bill that they've proposed, they've changed the language, but basically, in essence, it's to do the exact same thing. And a responsible government would stand up and say, look, it was a good idea and we've adopted it. Yet instead, they've done it on so many other bills. I still remember the bicycle lane legislation that our member from Dartmouth East brought in, and they turned around and brought theirs in the next day and said, this is our idea. Anyways, regardless, the last one of our recommendations that we've been made is regarding the fee for Efficiency Nova Scotia. Now, currently, under this government, the decision was made that that should be paid by all the ratepayers of Nova Scotia. But now we're hearing of some exceptions. So Nova Scotians, when they get their power bill, at a time where power rates are an all-time high here in Nova Scotia, are seeing a new fee on their bills that they didn't see before this government. And we've called it the NDP tax, which is the appropriate way of describing it. It is a tax imposed by the NDP. So we've suggested there's a different way of doing this. We've suggested that Efficiency Nova Scotia should be continued as it is structured, but the funding for it should come from Nova Scotia Power shareholders and not from ratepayers. So, Madam Speaker, again, a responsible government would say, let's have a discussion about that. And it was amusing but sad at the same time when my colleague from Halifax Clayton Park was speaking on this and made that suggestion. I heard the Minister of Community Services and other ministers say that what a ridiculous idea it was to suggest that Nova Scotia Power should pay for Efficiency Nova Scotia and not ratepayers. Members of the NDP caucus thought that was ridiculous. How could anyone ever suggest that? Well, I wanted to point out to a letter which I know, and I want to say I certainly want to recognize my colleague from Dartmouth East for the leadership that he has shown on behalf of our caucus on this file, his work through the rate hearings, his knowledge of the UARB and the process that's gone through with the rate hearings. It's amazing the amount of personal dedication that he has given to this file, his level of interest and his desire to want to bring forward ideas to help Nova Scotians. And I know he's raised this on numerous occasions, as is our leader, but I've made extra copies here because something tells me members of the government haven't seen this letter. So for those who haven't seen it, I'm certainly happy to give them copies here in case they haven't seen it. But what I want to refer to briefly in my remarks is what I have here is a letter dated June 3rd, 2009. And it's on letterhead here, Madam Speaker, that says, "For today's families," with the NDP logo on it. And it's addressed to the Chair of the Board, Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board. June 3rd, 2009. Now, why is that a relevant date? Because June 9th, 2009 is when the NDP were elected government in Nova Scotia. So this is a mere 6 days before their election. So you ask, well, how relevant is this letter and who wrote this letter? Well, the gentleman, I have copies here for the member for Guysborough. I already said there's copies here. By all means, don't wait for tabling. Come get your copy now. In fact, here, bring him a copy. Bring him a personal copy there. Oh yeah, just for the member for Guysborough. Bring him a copy. If any of the others chirp over there, come get a copy for them as well so they can see it. Who is it signed by? And why is this relevant? Well, it's signed by a Dan O'Connor. I think that's his name during the daytime. I'm not sure if that's his name all the time, but that's his name that he uses, at least in this letter. And it says he's the Chief of Staff to Darrell Dexter, or I guess that's what the letter says, but it's obviously the Premier now, at the time, leader of the NDP. Now, why is this letter relevant? Why should Nova Scotians care what Dan O'Connor wrote on June 3rd, 2009? So he writes to the members of the board, and he says, "I am making this representation on behalf of the New Democratic Party due to the fact that party officers are engaged with the current election campaign." So one has to assume he's a chief of staff, and he's saying in a letter that he speaks on behalf of the party, so one would have to think this is party policy, 6 days before an election campaign. Let me jump to the fourth paragraph, where it says, "The NDP is of the view that DSM cost allocation approach agreement, dated April 6, 2009, however, places the burden of DSM-related improvements too heavily on residential users and other rate classes. Distribution of the cost across the rate classes should not be the focus of this hearing or of the utility's efforts. It should rather be based on the notion that the utility will bear the cost for making DSM-related investments in order to stabilize its long-term position in the market and access to power for consumers of all classes." Interesting statement. Let me read on. The utility, and here's the justification why he believes, at the time, and the NDP supposedly believed, that Nova Scotia Power should pay these costs. He said, quote, "The utility will reap the direct benefits of effective DSM initiatives in terms of lower input costs and greater overall reliability of supply. DSM improvements that assist with considerable cost avoidance, example new generation capacity, or increase cost predictability, will no doubt provide for longer-term profitability for the utility that is proportional to projected $23 million investment in the short term." So, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, he's actually suggesting that Nova Scotia Power would benefit from the Efficiency Nova Scotia programs, that this would come as a financial benefit to them. So he goes on further. Let me continue with, quote, "Given that Nova Scotia Power Incorporated has indicated it will not apply for increased rates this year, and consumers are breathing a welcome sign of relief," and it's been a while since they've been able to breathe that, Madam Speaker, but "to place this surcharge on their power bills at this juncture would add unneeded and counterproductive costs to residential and business users." Wow. What happened? 6 days before the election. Wow. That was the position of the NDP. Wow. And to hear the Minister of Community Services say it's ridiculous that the Liberals or the member for Halifax Clayton Park would suggest that Nova Scotia Power shareholders should be paying for Efficiency Nova Scotia, it's just unbelievable to hear that, because I don't think she's seen the letter. And again, I have copies here in case she wants a copy for herself, because somehow they've forgotten about this. And yet, at no point in this House has any of them explained to us why would it be a bad thing to ask Nova Scotia Power to pay these costs? One of the arguments I've heard, not from the government, from others, is, well, what would stop Nova Scotia Power from turning around and when they go make their rate application of saying, here, we're going to include the extra cost of paying for Efficiency Nova Scotia on our rate claim? There's a solution to that, and our leaders offered a solution. This House could legislate that Nova Scotia Power cannot include the costs of funding Efficiency Nova Scotia as part of its rate application. There's the solution. So, how do the NDP react to this positive suggestion from the official opposition? Oh, the leader of the opposition wants to get rid of Efficiency Nova Scotia. That's what he wants to do.
That's truth, right, Denise? That's truth, right, saying that?
At no point have we ever suggested getting rid of Efficiency Nova Scotia. We believe it should remain independent as it is. What we fundamentally disagree with is that Nova Scotians who have a hard time making ends meet right now and having a hard time pay for their bills have to pay for Efficiency Nova Scotia, especially in light of the fact that it's Dan O'Connor's belief that Efficiency Nova Scotia provides a financial benefit to Nova Scotia Power. So if the end, well, I already mentioned that he's got different aliases, but anyways, on this alias that he goes with, he clearly makes that argument on behalf of the NDP. Now, no one has stood in this place to say he was wrong. No one has stood in their place to say Dan O'Connor's been fired, because he was so wrong in what he said. He misrepresented the values of the NDP. It wasn't part of for today's families in what he said. My understanding is he's still the Chief of Staff. So Nova Scotians are confused as to why, at a time when they're looking for leadership, that rather than the government actually say, let's have a discussion. Instead, it's let's attack the opposition, because they know they can't defend their record. Because under this administration, Nova Scotia Power rates have gone up by 25%. So I'm not going to be that much longer, Madam Speaker, because as you can probably see here, I have quite a volume of documents here that I could go through, but I'm not going to go through all of those, but always happy to help government members who are not clear on some of the comments I'm making. But earlier, the Premier, our leader of the opposition, in asking a question about the SAP program and sending it out to IBM, he quoted the Premier from prior to when he became Premier, saying how any such decision should take consultation, public consultation, before being done. And when the question was put, the government forgot about that. And there was no interest in any sort of discussion on that decision. But there are quotes and quotes that I could go through, and I'm just going to share one, because ironically, the individual who made this quote now sits in a fairly senior position. If anyone wants to fully understand what is the impact of increased power rates in this province and the impact that continual increases are having, one simply has to look at just but one excerpt that I will use from November 7, 2006. And it was the member for Halifax Needham, who now, ironically, is the Minister of Finance. And on page 125 of Hansard, she said, quote, "Mr. Speaker, you know, this is not only a problem for people who are in receipt of income support. This is a problem for people who are working. This is a problem for people who live on fixed incomes. This is a problem for seniors in our communities who have other demands on their incomes, often a growing demand to purchase healthcare services and pay premiums on their drug plans and co-pays for prescriptions. Quite often, that's the choice that all too many people are facing. Will I be able to pay for my power, my electricity? Will I be able to pay for my car insurance? Will I be able to pay for my drugs? So we do need to ask ourselves, to what extent does this bill address this serious, serious problem of affordable energy for people?" Madam Speaker, the Mayor of Halifax Needham was right in November 7, 2006, when she said, how does this bill address the serious problem of affordable energy for people? And she'd be right if she stood in her place again when it comes to Bill 97, is how does this bill address the serious problem of affordable energy for the people of Nova Scotia? Merci.
If I could ask the member perhaps to table the letter that he referenced. You did not table it, so. Thank you. If I'm to recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy, it will be to close debate.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank all the honourable members for their interventions and support and suggestions and ideas on Bill number 97, an act to amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act, to ensure fairer power rates. And you know, I've heard some good suggestions and some that I guess we agree on, and some others that perhaps we don't agree on. But we all agree, though, that power rates is an issue in this province, and that it's important that we find a way to ease the burden on Nova Scotians. We all have had constituents come into our office and saying that, you know, they're having troubles making ends meet, and part of that, it could be rent, it could be food, it could be other issues, but sometimes it's power bills, and we as MLAs try to find a solution that will make it more fair and make it easier for that family to pay their bills. And so this bill is outlining a number of suggestions on how to make it easier for Nova Scotians, and that includes, there seems to be general agreement around the idea of doing away with I guess bonuses or incentives to Nova Scotia power executives. I know I was on the doorsteps in Pictou a few weeks ago, and it came up several times that people didn't think it was fair that they had to pay for executive bonuses or executive incentives, and I agree with that. I don't think it is fair, and so that's why we've introduced this bill here today to make it more fair for Nova Scotians. And then also on executive salaries, some of them have gone up 300, 400, even over $1 million. So we're suggesting there should be a cap on that. And what should that cap be? It should be at the rate that's equivalent to the average salary of a deputy minister in this province. And that's somewhere around, well, I guess deputy ministers earn anywhere from $138,000 to about $191,000, but the average is somewhere around $173,000. And so we think that's fair. And if they want to pay their executives more money, then that's their choice to do that. But that would have to come from the shareholders, and not from the ratepayers. So we think that also is fair. We're also looking at you know, a review or a savings review process, and you know, just to make it between rate hearings, that there would be a way that savings could be identified to find more dollars that could come, you know, make more efficiencies in the system, and allow it to, in those years when there's not a rate hearing, that we could make that a system that would be automatic, that the UARB could then go and look at for additional savings, whether it's in maintenance or operation or in capital improvements, or on salaries that are paid to the people that work for the corporation. And of course, multiple rate hearings is the other one that you know, that at least 2 years, 3, it could be any length of time, but at least 2 years for a review of rate hearing. So I think it's a good bill, and again, I thank the members that have spoken and have given their input on this, and I now look forward to seeing it move along to the Law Amendments Committee. So again, I move second reading of Bill number 97. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The question is for second reading of Bill number 97, the fair power rates. Is the House ready for the question? All in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number number 97, an act to amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act, to ensure fair power rates.
Order that Bill number 97, the fair power rates, be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. Now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, could you please call Bill 102, the Education Act?
Now call Bill number 102, the Education Act. I recognize the Honourable Minister of Education. Oh, no? Of Agriculture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to move that Bill 102 be heard a second time, and to stand on behalf of the Minister of Education. Pleased to rise to speak to this bill called an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act. Madam Speaker, we know that bullying in all of its forms is a heartbreaking and complex problem with no easy answers. Students at Sycamore Lane Elementary School in Lower Sackville told the minister that experiencing bullying makes them feel vulnerable and alone. Madam Speaker, the stories of these students show that bullying has a real impact in our classrooms. They told the minister that when they are bullied, they can't concentrate and don't even want to come to school. They also shared the fact that having an opportunity through restorative approaches to talk through their problems in an open and supportive way at school gives them the confidence to excel. And Madam Speaker, the message of these students is clear. Support in schools is critical if we're going to make a difference for students dealing with incidents of severely disruptive behavior, including bullying and cyberbullying. And Madam Speaker, the proposed amendments in this bill help to formalize that support. These changes will ensure all staff working in schools have a clear understanding of their responsibilities when dealing with bullying and cyberbullying. The proposed amendments clarify, update, and define the role of all school staff in reporting incidents of severely disruptive behavior and the role of principals in dealing with it. And to be specific, Madam Speaker, these amendments create an obligation for all school staff, such as teaching assistants, custodians, or bus drivers, to report all incidents of severely disruptive behavior. I know all employees who work in our schools and with our students want our children to be safe. And Madam Speaker, members, I think are aware that I was a teacher for 15 years, and not that because my experience in the classroom makes me believe this, but like I think all members here, anybody who's a parent, has had their children in the system, would certainly like to know that they're safe in school every day. Madam Speaker, these changes formally recognize something that is largely already happening in practice. It's important to formally acknowledge the role of all school staff, such as teaching assistants, custodians, or bus drivers, in addressing all forms of severely disruptive behavior, including bullying and cyberbullying. And teachers are already required to report incidents of severely disruptive behavior in our Education Act, but these proposed amendments will update the terminology used to describe a teacher's responsibility with respect to student behavior and consequences to reflect the terminology already used in other sections of the Act, as well as the regulations and the school code of conduct. The description of this type of behavior will change from persistently defiant or disobedient to severely disruptive. Madam Speaker, the minister had heard from students at Halifax West High School that when teachers and principals are positive and supportive when students report an incident of bullying or cyberbullying, it makes all the difference in helping them feel safe and secure in their classroom and at school. And I know teachers, principals, and indeed all school staff members have a strong influence in the culture of a school community, and their support can bring about change. Well, Madam Speaker, this bill also clarifies the principal's duty to investigate and respond to reports of severely disruptive behavior. This response will be consistent with a list of possible interventions that are clearly defined in the Provincial Code of Conduct and used in schools across the province. It also provides clear parameters for the principal's duty to notify parents or guardians. This notification will take place for the parents of all students involved in an incident of severely disruptive behavior if the principal believes the well-being of a student has been endangered. And Madam Speaker, this bill recognizes that all school staff are working together to promote a safe and positive learning environment by consistently reporting and responding to incidents of severely disruptive behavior such as bullying and cyberbullying. And Madam Speaker, we will ensure these staff members have the appropriate training needed to implement this change. The provisions in the Act that require reporting of all school staff and response by the principal are subject to proclamation. Madam Speaker, I want to clarify what this means. The Department of Education will establish a plan for training by the end of November and ensure all school boards, unions, and staff groups involved are aware of these proposed changes to the Education Act, what it means for them, and how school boards and the department will work together to provide training. The proclamation of the bill will happen early in the new year after the training plan has been implemented. And in this way, we will ensure we've got the training in place before the new statutory requirements are effective. These proposed amendments are in response to recommendations from the Provincial Task Force and build on previous amendments to the Education Act. The Minister introduced in the spring session, which promoted respectful and responsible relationships. Madam Speaker, the previous legislative changes laid the framework of the adoption of a consistent definition of bullying and cyberbullying, and we are working now to implement this in regulation. Also in the spring, in my responsibility as the Minister for Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, made amendments to the Consumer Protection Act to require cell phone suppliers to provide each customer, at no additional cost to the customer, educational materials about responsible cellular telephone use, including cyberbullying, when a contact is made. Together, these legislative amendments provide an even stronger foundation for developing the province's action plan. And Madam Speaker, we are taking a measured, comprehensive approach to dealing with a complex problem. We are developing a provincial action plan to address this serious issue and promote safe, positive learning environments in our schools. As we move forward, Madam Speaker, our focus will be on providing supports for youth to make positive choices in any situation and help them understand the impact of their behavior on others as they navigate this ever-changing world. Madam Speaker, I also want to stress that legislation is just one step in the province's action plan to fight bullying and cyberbullying. There are societal issues, and if we are going to address the root cause, Madam Speaker, a community response is needed. As part of our action plan, the province is working on several fronts with students and partners to fight bullying and cyberbullying in schools. And Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to share the highlights of some of this work with the House. Kathleen Richard is working as our new anti-bullying coordinator, exploring evidence-based programs for delivery in schools and developing an anti-bullying website. Madam Speaker, the website will offer the opportunity to disseminate information, share resources, and provide online learning tools for youth, parents, and school staff. Kathleen will be instrumental in organizing and building a working group to coordinate the government response to all aspects of this issue. And this group will include expert perspectives from community services, justice, and health and wellness. She is also working with the Nova Scotia Youth Advisory Council to secure a youth voice and input in governmental policies. And Madam Speaker, this is only one way that we are involving youth in our work, because their voice is the most valuable voice in our efforts to combat bullying and cyberbullying. They know they live this reality, and it's extremely important that we work with their ideas as we move forward with our action plan. We're also working directly with a group of students from Bayview Community School in Mahone Bay to develop a public awareness campaign based on their theme, People, Not Profiles. These students were here in the legislature on October 29th when the minister tabled the bill. Madam Speaker, the vision of this enthusiastic group certainly shows that students know what bullying looks like and how it affects people in the schoolyard, in the community, or online. They have great ideas on how to make a difference. Madam Speaker, we're listening and incorporating the ideas of students directly in our action plan. We've also enhanced the behavior incident tracking form, and it is now available across the province through Power School. And Madam Speaker, this will help to streamline the reporting process and provide better data to help us understand what is really happening with severely disruptive behaviors in our schools. But most importantly, better data will help our anti-bullying coordinator determine programming needs. It will also assist principals and teachers to identify the roots of this issue in their schools and allow targeted responses to limit opportunities for students to engage in bullying and cyberbullying. Schools Plus is now supporting children, youth, and families in every region in our province. And young people across Nova Scotia, like those that the minister had mentioned in Sycamore Lane, are learning new ways to manage relationships and conflict through restorative approaches. Madam Speaker, Kids and Learning First, the province's plan to help every child succeed, commits to fight against cyberbullying, and that's exactly what we're doing. So I'm proud of the work underway to fight bullying and cyberbullying and of the proposed amendments to this bill. Madam Speaker, as we move forward with the provincial action plan, we will continue to take a collaborative approach, working with students, their families, schools, and partners to make real change. So I look forward to having these amendments in place to help provide further framework to support the province's action plan and continued efforts to address the problem of bullying and cyberbullying in our schools. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to say thank you to the member opposite who spoke on behalf of the minister. The member is someone that I know to be a true educator and who cares about kids, so I appreciate those comments coming from you. I want to speak to Bill 102, and when you look at the whole issue of bullying and cyberbullying in our schools and in our society, it appears that the minister and the government don't understand the seriousness of the issue. And the reason I say that is because the amount of time that has been lapsed without any concrete steps to curb that behavior is alarming, and it's sad, Madam Speaker. If you look at Bill 102, which is the one we're talking about today, the bill still continues to refer to severely disruptive behavior, and the member spoke about severely disruptive behavior. And the language is misleading, because any educator will tell you that severely disruptive behavior is not always an example of bullying or cyberbullying. We know that we have reported to us by principals that 95% of the incidents in their schools are difficult to identify. They're not obvious. Using the internet and other social media to harass or bully someone is often a very quiet, discreet, silent kind of behavior. So to suggest that it's severely disruptive is, as I say, misleading. It's misleading to those kinds of behaviors that are cyberbullying, but it's also a bit disrespectful, Madam Speaker, to those children in our system who do exhibit severely disruptive behavior, not by choice, Madam Speaker, but they have, in many cases, some form of behavior issues that they can't control. And to suggest that they could change that this legislation will help change that, is quite disrespectful. They don't want to be severely disruptive. Their parents don't want them to be severely disruptive, but it's a condition that they cannot control. So to suggest that the silent, discreet kind of online bullying and harassment is the same as the severely disruptive behavior from perhaps an autistic child is quite misleading. We had asked earlier, Madam Speaker, that that language be changed to better reflect what we're really talking about, and unfortunately, Bill 101 does not do that. When you look at the clauses in Bill 101, there are 5 clauses, and 3 of them, typical of this minister and this kind of legislation, 3 of them are language terminology changes. Only 2 of them, Madam Speaker, speak to bullying and cyberbullying. And they, in fact, Madam Speaker, refer to actions that are already included in the Education Act. The responsibility of principals to respond, investigate, that's a responsibility that all teachers have in the Act. To suggest that principals don't report this kind of behavior is suggesting that we don't have much faith in our principals and our school administrators if they don't follow up on and report. So those 2 clauses are really, in my opinion, redundant because those are already responsibilities that are outlined in the Education Act. So 5 clauses, 3 terminology, 2 irrelevant to anything that might change behavior, suggests to me and to others that this piece of legislation will not make one bit of difference in addressing the issue of cyberbullying in our schools. You know, Madam Speaker, we saw this in the spring. We saw a piece of legislation, Bill 30, that came through. Again, the same approach to a very, very serious issue. We had, and I commend the government for calling for a task force. And that call was made in February of last year, 2011. And some very dedicated, committed, and expert people in their field came together. And they worked for 9 months. And they were dedicated to the mandate that they had been given. They each brought their own perspective to that task force committee. And after 9 months, they presented the minister with their report. And, Madam Speaker, that report contained 85 recommendations. And as a result of that report, that's when we saw the first piece of legislation which really did not address anything that the task force had been recommending, except to hire an anti-bullying coordinator. And the minister came out quickly and said, no, 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 we wouldn't be accepting that. And then after pressure from parents and media and others, the minister changed her mind, I guess, and said, oh, well, we will find one. We won't hire anybody new. We will find one. And it took until this fall for that person to be identified and to start doing what an anti-bullying coordinator might be supposed to do. So when I talk about the delays and the lags in time in getting anything that's going to be addressing the real problem, we started in February of 2011, and it's now November of 2012. Law amendments was a wonderful opportunity for people to come before the committee to express their concerns about the lack of anything in the legislation that would change behavior. And they came before the Law Amendments Committee in a nonpartisan way. They came as experts in their own field or as somebody who had experienced the loss of a child as a result of cyberbullying. And they pleaded with the Law Amendments Committee to include some amendments that would put some teeth into that legislation. Wayne McKay chaired the task force committee. Very well recognized, credible, strong person in education and law. And he asked the committee to please consider amendments that would strengthen the bill. One of the other members of the task force who brought another perspective, from the police service perspective, came and spoke to the Law Amendments Committee about the lack of teeth in the legislation that was being introduced and the need to have the amendments accepted. And thirdly, Pam Murchison, Jenna's mother, came and spoke as somebody who had experienced a loss as a result of cyberbullying that she wanted to make sure would not happen to any other child. And she pleaded with the committee to accept the amendments. No, those amendments were not accepted. And now they see another piece of legislation which does nothing. And I think, Madam Speaker, we know the issue. We know it exists. We know it's growing. We know it's a social issue. We know it's played out a lot in our schools, and we know that schools have a responsibility. Not the only responsibility, but they do have a responsibility. And it's parents and teachers and the whole community, law enforcement, everyone, has a role to play. And what we wanted to see in the legislation, and what we failed to see in the legislation, is anything that would give any one of those groups of people the teeth to make a change in individual behaviors. You know, Madam Speaker, if you want to bring about change, you have to clearly identify the behaviors that are unacceptable. You also have to, and you have to communicate that. People need to know whether their behavior is acceptable or not. Some people can't make that judgment call. Secondly, there need to be some consequences that are clearly identified, and you match them up. Inappropriate behavior, here's the consequence. Communicate that. That seems like a very simple, not a costly action that could have been included in this legislation, but it's not. You also have the role, as I've mentioned earlier, about the law enforcement officers who are dealing with this in their capacity. And they have asked, and our amendments asked, that the Minister of Justice begin immediately to have some dialogue with his federal counterparts regarding the criminal code. All I was asking was that that dialogue begin, because the police services in this province have identified that that nothing in the criminal code speaks to this the way it should. All it was asking wouldn't cost any money, not millions of dollars that we're throwing around this province, but something that wouldn't cost 1 red cent. But it would begin a dialogue that could bring about some change. Not included. Dismissed. Amendments were not accepted. Another amendment that we believe, the people who came before our law amendments believe, the people who came together with that task force report believe, was that principals, once they have investigated, once they believe that someone's activities have been inappropriate and inappropriately using some bit of technology, that they have a responsibility to inform the service provider that someone is misusing the account that they have set up. All they have to do is report it. They don't have any responsibility or any authority to do anything about that account. But they do have a responsibility to make sure that the service provider is aware of somebody misusing the account that they have set up. Wouldn't cost 1 red cent. But no, the committee, the Law Amendments Committee, dominated by the members of the government, said no. And so we had people like Wayne McKay and Pam Murchison and others walk away in absolute disgust, and I mean disgust. Madam Speaker, I will table these documents, but I want to conclude by sharing some of the comments that have been made, some of the frustration and anger and disappointment that people have with the lack of legislation that will address a very serious problem. We have, for example, Pam, whose daughter Jenna took her life. And her comment was, "I am not satisfied with the province's response." Dr. Wayne McKay says he was critical of the government's steps. He said, like Murchison, he doesn't believe data collection is the answer. Now, Pam's mother, Pam also goes on to say, there needs to be consequences for their actions. Those are pretty strong statements. Those were statements that were made when those people realized that the opportunity that this government had, I have them here, the opportunity that this government had, take them all, the opportunity that this government had, they failed miserably to take advantage of that opportunity. You also have, in a CBC interview, Wayne McKay saying, cyberbullying should be made a crime. That was one of the recommendations. That was his thought. It's not for me or you to decide, Madam Speaker, or any member of this House to decide what is a crime. But it is our responsibility to ensure that the dialogue begins with the people responsible for the criminal code to make that decision and to have that discussion. I will go on. We had the minister herself said more study is needed before the government comes out with any specific measures. Well, how many years does this minister need, and how much more recommendation does she need from experts to come out and take some action? Wayne McKay again, the legislation lacked concrete steps after nearly a year and a half of study. The members of that task force committee felt very disrespected when they worked for 9 months, came up with 85 recommendations, and it did not translate into anything that would make a difference. Even the executive director of the Bullying Canada said he was not impressed with the government's approach. Then we can go on, and an article that was written in the Chronicle Herald, comments by Marilla Stevenson, and her comment is, and I quote, "Can Gen-X not simply acknowledge the problem is real and get on with doing something about it?" This is the level of dissatisfaction, disappointment that the community has with this particular minister, with this particular piece of legislation, and with this particular government, who are letting every kid in our school down by not giving those in charge some teeth to take some action and to make a difference. So, Madam Speaker, I believe that every person in this House has a responsibility, and I believe every person in this House should be big enough to put aside their party politics and sit down together and look at what is in the best interest of kids. The Law Amendments Committee is controlled by the government, yet they fail to acknowledge and recognize anything that is not coming from them. And the community is dissatisfied, those on the task force committee are dissatisfied, and kids are crying out for help. And the parents of the kids who are being bullied have decided that this government is doing nothing, and they will take it into their own hands. Thank you very much.
I now recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I stand today to speak to Bill 102, the Education Act. Madam Speaker, it's good to see the government is attempting to do something about bullying and cyberbullying in this province. But the effects and what they're trying to do, they're not going far enough, Madam Speaker. It's unfortunate, but incidents of bullying and cyberbullying seem to be on the rise in this province. Madam Speaker, time is passing us by, and with each passing day and nothing being done, more tragedies are occurring. And the results of this behavior can be devastating to students, to family, to school, and the general population. Anyone who's watched the heartbreaking video of Amanda Todd made before her death can see the toll that bullying and cyberbullying can take on our young people. Right here in Nova Scotia, we have way too many tragedies because of bullying and cyberbullying. Parents, grandparents, teachers, and everyone else in this province know that bullying is a big problem. A problem that we can't ignore, and a problem that can't be glossed over. Madam Speaker, bullying and cyberbullying are problems that need forceful and swift action. Our children's lives depend on it, Madam Speaker. That's why this caucus introduced 3 pieces of legislation and 3 would-be bills last spring. Bills that would take swift and forceful action to reduce bullying and cyberbullying in our schools. Legislation that provide real consequences for those who initiate the bullying behavior. And Madam Speaker, we reached out to the 2 other caucuses in an attempt to build an all-party approach to this huge problem. We reached out in a nonpartisan way to make sure that we as a legislature dealt with this serious incident, their serious problem, but that didn't work. We offered amendments to the government to their weak legislation, but that was ignored. Unfortunately, our efforts have been unsuccessful. So instead of taking a definite action to stop bullying and cyberbullying, this government pushed through the Promotion of Respectful and Responsibility Relationships Act. And Madam Speaker, I think that the minister thought she could point to the passage of the bills as proof that she had done something about bullying in Nova Scotia. What she had actually done was begin the process of counting the number of incidents of bullying in this province. Then the Minister of Education assured parents that an anti-bullying coordinator would be put in place by September. A position she said would come from within the system and not cost the system any more money. Well, Madam Speaker, the school year came and began, and no coordinator was in place. Kids were no safer then than they were the year before. Madam Speaker, it's not just the opposition parties who believe the minister's performance on this file has been disappointing. Wayne McKay, the chairman of the Home Minister's Task Force on Cyberbullying, was a guest on CBC Cross Country Checkup a week or so ago. In his interview, concluded Professor McKay, to be fairly brutally honest about this, break my heart might be a bit strong, but I'm a bit disappointed that the government have not reached out more forcefully and quickly, specifically, I guess, here in Nova Scotia. Professor McKay said what parents and grandparents and teachers know. Government and others must move quickly to prevent more tragedies due to bullying. Madam Speaker, a Cape Breton mother recently called my office to tell her story about bullying. And her frustration that her daughter's school could not or would not do anything to stop it was evident in her voice. She tried to work with the school board, and she even went as far as calling the anti-bullying coordinator. All of her efforts came to nothing. At every turn, she was told there was nothing they could do, that she didn't deal with incidents that the bullying coordinator didn't deal directly with the incidents of the bullying behavior. Madam Speaker, this mother knows that this government hasn't done enough, and she doesn't feel that her child was being protected. And just recently we heard another story of a lady, I think it was in Truro area, who had to move her family out of that area because of the bullying incidents. That young girl would have to learn a new school, make new friends, and her education is being severely curtailed because of that. And here we are today, Madam Speaker. The Minister introduces this bill in another attempt to be doing something. According to a press release from the Minister, this act is to help clarify, update, and define the role of all school staff in reporting incidents of severely disruptive behavior and of the principals in dealing with it. What do we get? More counting. Madam Speaker, the time for counting is over. It's time for forceful and swift action against bullying. And we don't think this bill does that. With this bill, the Minister's blown another opportunity to protect our kids in our classrooms. We think it's a weak bill that doesn't go far enough or fast enough. It doesn't define in law what bullying is. It doesn't provide real and meaningful consequences for those who bully. The measures contained in this bill, and in many more, are already contained in our progressive conservative bills that are sitting on our order paper. This is an occasion, Madam Speaker, where this caucus would welcome the government stealing our ideas. This issue is just too important to let it sit idly by. I urge the Minister carefully consider the Safer Schools Act. It's a bill that defines bullying and compels the Minister to put province-wide standards in place for bullying prevention, reporting, and intervention. It requires the Minister to consider appropriate disciplinary measures when bullying occurs and ensures school boards establish disciplinary policies for their own schools consistent with the provincial standards and report bullying on an annual basis. Our Cyberbullying Intervention Act defines cyberbullying in law, makes it an offense, provides for penalties, or in appropriate cases, for offenders to be redirected to alternative measures programs. Madam Speaker, we tried this last year to sit down with the opposite party and see if we could get them to negotiate even some of our bills and some of our clauses in our bills so that we could deal with bullying now, so that we could start the school year and have something in place for our educators, for our school boards, for our parents, and for our students, so that we could put an end to this situation, or at least curtail it, and make sure that our kids were protected. Our Act empowers judges to order restrictions on use of electronic devices, including confiscation, if it's in the public's best interest to do so. And we've heard that maybe it was someone else's device, or someone else's computer, or someone else's telephone. But Madam Speaker, this is a serious, serious problem. If someone allows them to use their telephone or their computer, then maybe these restrictions should be put in place on them. Madam Speaker, our bills is what swift and forceful action look like. We wanted to take this action, Madam Speaker, to protect society and protect our children from a situation in society that's been devastating to children, parents, teachers, and all others in society. Madam Speaker, that's what legislation is designed to do. Provide meaningful protection for our children. And Madam Speaker, that's what this minister should be doing. She should be taking swift action to make sure that bullying in our society stops. And with those few words, Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the member for Truro Bible Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I rise in my place today to make a few comments about Bill 102. I am very much in favor of this bill. As the MLA for Truro Bible Hill, where we've had several incidents of bullying, cyberbullying, very, very serious incidents where children have actually taken their own lives, who have felt that there was no way out, who suffered from depression, and who unfortunately took the path of violence against themselves. I am very close to this issue. I do a lot of work on the ground about this issue with my community and with those directly involved. And I have to say that people in Truro Bible Hill are thrilled by this bill. The people I have spoken to are thrilled. We all know that this is the beginning of many steps to come, but this is the first government in Nova Scotia who has actually addressed this issue and is actually doing something. Yeah. And in fact, this is our second bill when it comes to bullying, Mr. Speaker, and I think that the opposition needs to remember that. Just recently, we held a vigil for Amanda Todd, the young girl who committed suicide in British Columbia. Her aunt, Leanna Todd, is a good friend of mine. She lives in Truro, and she invited me as her MLA to speak at the candlelight vigil and anti-bullying rally that we held in Truro a few weeks ago. I did so, and I brought greetings from the government, from the Minister of Education, and I talked about this bill and many of the other things that this government is doing, including having the coordinator, the cyberbullying coordinator, who's now been named by the province, who is going to be looking into this issue all the way along now and working with schools and educators. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious problem, and it's not just something that you can legislate away. It seems to me that the opposition parties seem to feel that we can just wave a magic wand and legislate a change in society that is going to automatically get rid of bullying for once and for all. Well, I'm sorry, but bullying takes place in this very house. I've heard it with my own ears when people bully each other, where they call each other names. And I'm sorry, but this is not, I don't think this is an acceptable practice. It doesn't send a good message to our young people. And I think that young people today need to see adults acting responsibly and need to be acting with respect to one another. And, right? Thank you. And you can't legislate that. That is something that society has to deal with and society has to decide, which is why our government keeps saying this is a community problem, and we intend to work with community, with children, with parents, with teachers, but you cannot legislate it away. I want to read something which I will table, Mr. Speaker. It's by Heather Harris, the president of Peaceful Schools International. What she says is, quote, keeping issues of building and maintaining positive relationships integrated into our curriculum year-long are very important. Teaching, modeling, and practicing strategies of resolving conflict, which includes the responsibilities of the bystander, the victim, and the offender, are all very important. This is truly a community concern that cannot be addressed by only teachers. It will take long-term concerted effort by parents, teachers, students, and the social media. We have been successful in establishing that bullying is not acceptable, but we need to bump it up to the next step and talk about the alternatives. There are many different ways to stand up to a bully other than proving that you're just bigger or stronger and a bully yourself. We need to identify the many ways to stand up to a bully, find the ones that work best for individuals, and practice them, talk about them, and stand up as a united team. We also need to realize that there is a function or reason that bullies offend and work to resolve those issues as well. Otherwise, they will just find other sources. And again, that is from Heather Harris, President of Peaceful Schools International. Now, and this is where I would like to also address the issue that if you scratch the surface of a bully, you are going to find somebody who has obviously been bullied or abused themselves. So as someone who is from a family of educators, one of my family members is a guidance counselor, I know that they have to work with the bullies as well as the victims. And when you do scratch the surface of a bully, you can find a very sad, scared, frightened, angry little person in there, rather like some of the people probably in the house once in a while. And we need to really address those issues of their own, how they feel about themselves and make them feel better about themselves so that they don't have to take out their frustrations on others. So, Mr. Speaker, with these few words, I would like to close. But I do want to say that there is a lot of support for Bill 102 out there in Nova Scotia. And I think Nova Scotians are pleased that their government is actually standing up, speaking about this problem, and encouraging the discussion and encouraging reaching across to all divides, and let's come together to form a solution for the problem of bullying and cyberbullying in our society. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Cumberland South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do want to speak for a few moments to this bill because the issue of bullying is so important in our society today. In fact, it may well be one of the biggest threats that our young people face. Before I go any further, though, Mr. Speaker, I do just want to say that I appreciate the remarks of the member opposite, the member for Truro Bible Hill, who just spoke, that we all have a duty to set a good example, to show in the adult world that bullying is not tolerated in any of its forms or places. And I know she raised as an example this very chamber, this House of Assembly, that she sees the activities that go on here, particularly when things get heated, particularly during times like question period. And I agree that we need to renew our commitment on all sides of the House to use this chamber as an example of how adult debate and disagreement can be conducted and how we can all strive to make better decisions for our province in a respectful and proper manner. And I appreciate that she raised that. I will say, Mr. Speaker, as the father of two young daughters myself, who watches them as they go off to school every day and come home in the evening, that their experience is not the same as those of us here would have experienced in the run of a day when we were their age, when we were children in our schools. And I will say respectfully that I'm not sure that it is entirely fair to them to compare the to and fro that goes on in this chamber to the reality of bullying for our young people today. They face a very difficult world, Mr. Speaker, with all due respect. They go to school, they are in conversations with their friends and neighbors and the people that live around them, not only in the real world, as we know, not only on the school grounds, as we know, but sadly also on the internet, in texting, on Facebook, Twitter, all the modern ways that people now have conversations with each other. And the sad reality for young people today is even after they're off the school ground, even after they've made their way home, even at that time when they're in their own home where we would all like to believe that they are safe, embraced by the loving arms of their mother or father, their guardian, their parents in their own home, that today they're still not safe because of cyberbullying. And indeed, we've seen tragic circumstances where the combination of real bullying and cyberbullying, which is just as real, but on the internet, has driven some of our young Nova Scotians to extremes of despair and depression. And Mr. Speaker, as adults in this chamber and indeed around the province, we have a duty, a responsibility to do all we can to protect them, to keep them safe, whether they're on the school ground, whether they're out and about in their hometown, and whether they're home in the comfort of their own home and on a laptop or on a smart cell phone. And Mr. Speaker, that's why I say that this issue is so important and so different from what our own experience was. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that in my own riding, in the town of Parsbro, a tragedy has struck because of bullying and cyberbullying. And that was a very dark time for the family directly involved, obviously, Mr. Speaker, but a dark time for the whole town. But as MLA for the area, I was very proud to sit down with the parents so shortly after such a horrible circumstance, and see in them a desire to make sure that the town learned the lessons of that awful circumstance, that all levels of government, municipal, provincial, federal, school boards, and others, came together with the community itself to make that town of Parsbro a safer place for their children. And I raise this example, Mr. Speaker, because the great lesson of that awful time, which has been duplicated in other towns and villages and cities around Nova Scotia far too often, is that this is not just a teacher problem or a principal problem to solve, or a custodian problem, or a school bus driver problem to solve. That will only truly keep our community safe for our children when we all do our bit, when the entire community itself takes up responsibility for keeping our children safe. And that's why I'm so disappointed, Mr. Speaker, with this government bill, which truly doesn't go nearly far enough. It requires teachers and principals and school bus drivers and custodians to count the incidences of bullying when they see it in their schools. And I guess that's fine. I wish we could stand up here, or somebody could, and say this will actually reduce the amount of bullying that goes on, or will begin to address the cyberbullying that goes on, or begin to address the fact that today that bullying happens everywhere, even in our own homes. But it doesn't. In fact, I think one of the great weaknesses of this weak response is that it puts the problem on the shoulders of our teachers and our principals and our custodians and our school bus drivers and says, you count it and let us know how it's going. Well, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians, they deserve a lot more than that on an issue as important as keeping our kids safe, on an issue as important as stopping cyberbullying and bullying in its tracks, not just counting it. In fact, even when it comes to counting it, Mr. Speaker, the government fails to provide a definition of what bullying is so people will know it when they see it, or cyberbullying. This is one of the areas where the government actually has taken such a sharp departure from the anti-bullying task force, chaired by Mr. Wayne McKay, which last year involved all Nova Scotians in gathering of information, in great provincial discussion and discovery about what we can do, what we can really do to not just count bullying, but actually reduce it, actually wipe it out, knowing our kids will be safe. One of the things that task force said was we ought to define bullying and cyberbullying in law. Seems like common sense. It is an offense by any commonsensical definition. Any typical Nova Scotian would agree that it is an offense and should be defined as an offense in law. And yet the government has not taken up that recommendation from the anti-bullying task force. The government's had 2 opportunities to do that. Their first action, which the previous speaker spoke of, was to enable the Department of Education to appoint an anti-bullying coordinator. I know that the previous speaker believes that Nova Scotians are thrilled by that action. Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, the ones I hear from will be thrilled when they see a government that actually takes steps to stop bullying in its place in their communities. The second bill, Mr. Speaker, the one that we're talking about today, I've already described it, counts bullying, makes it the teacher's responsibility and the others in the school's responsibility to count bullying. The government believes that people will be thrilled to know that they've taken such a bold and decisive step to stop bullying in its tracks, except it won't stop bullying. It's a weak, tepid, sad step on such an important topic. Right. Mr. Speaker, that's the problem that I know many of us on this side of the House have with this bill that the government claims people are thrilled with. People will not be thrilled, Mr. Speaker, and they will not be satisfied until they see a government that actually takes strong action to stop bullying, like the Anti-Bullying Task Force recommended. Define bullying in law, make it an offense, spell out the ramifications to the offender, the punishments to the offender for bullying or cyberbullying. That would be a good start, Mr. Speaker, down the road of making our community safer. Give police the tools they need to keep our streets and our schoolyards and our towns and villages safe from bullying. Get tough on bullies, Mr. Speaker. That's what people will be thrilled to see when they see it from their government. And Mr. Speaker, I understand that there are bullies who also need help. That's exactly why when the Progressive Conservative Caucus introduced its bullying bill, that alongside of making bullying and cyberbullying an offense in law, in provincial law, and spelling out the punishments, it also allows for proper restitution of bullies, often young people themselves, so that they are given an opportunity to get off the wrong track and onto the right track. Because at its core, Mr. Speaker, anti-bullying laws should be about freeing the victims from the course that they are on and getting the bullies off of the course that they are on and save every child. That's what the PC bill does. It gets right to the root of the problem. This bill does none of that. It counts it. It doesn't get to the root of the problem. No one's going to be safer because of this bill. A lot of people could be safer. A lot of young people could be safer if the government would reach across the aisle and look at the bills that have been proposed on this side of the House, which go a lot further than this government is willing to go to protect our young people. Mr. Speaker, cyberbullying in particular, if I could just address that for a moment, the new scourge on our society that attacks so many young people no matter where they are, also needs to be addressed in a more serious way than this. And I've heard people say, well, young people should just turn off their computer, turn off their cell phone if they don't like what they see. Well, that doesn't work, Mr. Speaker, because we all have to understand that is actually how young people, and not just young people, but particularly young people, communicate with each other today. You might as well tell them to stop talking to their friends and neighbors as to tell them to turn off their cell phone or turn off their laptop. I'll tell you, in my own household, Mr. Speaker, I could ask my children to do many things as their dad. Some of them they'll even listen to from time to time. But it's kind of like a caucus, Mr. Speaker. But to take away their cell phone, to take away their laptop, that actually makes a greater victim of the victim. Mr. Speaker, and no one should propose that. What we should do is make sure that our justice system, our police, our judges, our community leaders have all the tools they need to get those cell phones, those laptops, those computers, that internet access out of the hands of cyberbullies as a preventive measure, rather than tell the victims to turn off their phones. Let's actually give judges the power on application to confiscate an electronic device that's being used for the purpose of bullying another Nova Scotian, particularly a young Nova Scotian. That's not in this bill, Mr. Speaker, but that's actually a very progressive piece of law that we could be a leader on right here in Nova Scotia. Because in the hands of a bully, the internet, a cell phone, a laptop becomes a weapon. And sadly, too often an anonymous weapon to harm another person, to harm my child or yours or someone that you know, Mr. Speaker. And when we know that to be true, those of us in a position of leadership in this province, we have a duty to do all we can to stop it in its tracks. Not just to count it, not just to tell the bus driver to make a note. We all have a duty to put in place strong laws with strong penalties when we know cyberbullying to exist, when we know bullying to exist, when we know the awful tragedies that can occur when it's left undealt with, Mr. Speaker. And that's why, again, on our side of the House, we have proposed bills to empower judges to take away an offensive weapon like a laptop when it is so used, or a cell phone. Then we'll be sending a strong signal to all communities, to bullies, that that kind of behavior will not be tolerated. And Mr. Speaker, I will say as a parent that on this theme that we all have a duty to protect our young people, we all have a duty to stop bullying where we see it, and cyberbullying. That includes parents and guardians who have children in their homes, who have laptops and who have cell phones, who may be using them unsupervised to perpetrate bullying or cyberbullying. Those parents too, or guardians, they have a responsibility to make sure that those laptops and those cell phones, they're not used as weapons against another young Nova Scotian. And I call on all the parents and guardians of the province to come together to make sure that that is true. Mr. Speaker, a reality of small-time life in Nova Scotia is that often everyone in town knows who the bullies are, but feel helpless to do anything about it, or won't do anything about it. Well, Mr. Speaker, we need a bill in this House that goes far beyond this one, that empowers all of those people, parents, community leaders, police, all of them together to stop bullying when they see it, to give them the tools to stop cyberbullying when they see it. That's what will thrill the people of Nova Scotia who are looking to us to protect their children. This is a great role for government to play, Mr. Speaker. It's not happening today, but it is a great role for government to play if it chooses to. And so, Mr. Speaker, I call on the government to look at all the bills before this House and to look around the country at all the other initiatives that are being taken to stop bullying. And I call on the government to read again its own anti-bullying task force report and to bring in a better bill, a stronger bill that actually goes beyond this one and protects our kids where they see them. And I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker, because there is hope. There is hope for a safer and better day if we get this right. In the town of Parsboro, Mr. Speaker, in the face of tragedy, that community came together. All of the community leaders, whether they were political leaders or business leaders or volunteer leaders, and they found a building, and they had material donated, and they had labor donated, and they built a new youth center for the town of Parsboro. And they built it so that there would be a place that they knew in town that young people could be safe, that they could study or play or talk or surf the internet in safety. That is the ray of light that the people of Parsboro found in a time of darkness, Mr. Speaker. So let us all resolve in this House that we're going to do a better job than this bill proposes for our young people, that we're going to lift the darkness of bullying and provide a ray of light not just to Parsboro, but to all of Nova Scotia by calling on the government to come back with a better and stronger bill that truly protects our children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the time today.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you.
To close debate.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to close debate on Bill 102. Thank the members opposite for their interventions and look forward to this bill going to law amendments. Thank you very much.
The motion before the House is to close debate and move the bill to law amendments. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded? Bill has been moved to law amendments.
Bill number 102, an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 105, the Agriculture and Marketing Act?
I recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill 105 be now read a second time. I want to say it's a pleasure to rise in the House today to talk about amendments to the Agricultural Marketing Act that I've introduced. These are housekeeping amendments, Mr. Speaker, and are fairly straightforward. The Agricultural Marketing Act is the main legislation that governs policies and programs for Nova Scotia's agricultural industry. This act addresses a wide variety of specific things related to agriculture. For example, it provides for the formation of agriculture, horticulture, and commodity organizations. It addresses seed growing, soil improvement, land conservation, pastures, and diseases and pests. It covers county and district exhibitions, and it covers agricultural education. It refers to dairy, fur, bees, wine, and other natural products. There's a lot in this act, Mr. Speaker, but there's something missing that should have been included from the outset. The act isn't clear about our general authority to address new developments and issues in the agricultural industry. It doesn't clearly spell out my authority as minister to develop policies or programs that meet the evolving needs of farmers and others in the industry. And as I'm sure my colleagues can appreciate, when a new issue or opportunity crops up, it's helpful to have clear authority to address it. The amendments we've introduced will give us that clear authority. They will improve our ability to support the agricultural industry. But let me give an example. A number of years ago, the need emerged to encourage Nova Scotians to support farmers by buying more local food. This is not something that was anticipated when the Act was originally drafted. However, it emerged as an opportunity to support our farmers by increasing the amount of local food Nova Scotians buy. We believe this is within our mandate, and Select Nova Scotia was launched to meet that need, and the members opposite, certainly from the Conservative Party, would remember that because they were instrumental in getting that done. However, it would have been helpful to have more clarity in the legislation for pursuing this kind of initiative. With amendments to the Act, it will be easier to build on this successful initiative in the future. So, Mr. Speaker, the authority to create policy and programs that we're adding to this Act are ones that should have been included in the first place. These are basic powers that any minister would need to effectively carry out his or her department's mandate. And I would ask my honourable colleagues to recognize that agriculture is a multi-million-dollar industry that contributes to the provincial economy and provides good jobs in rural communities throughout Nova Scotia. These amendments to the Agricultural Marketing Act will help us to more effectively support farmers and all members of the industry both now and in the future. That's good for the industry, and that's good for all Nova Scotians. So I look forward to the interventions of colleagues across the floor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to rise in my place today and speak to Bill number 105, the Agriculture and Marketing Act, and the amendments to this Act essentially give the province clearer authority, in particular the minister, to respond to emerging issues and opportunities in the industry. And there's no question the minister prior to his time in the ministerial role was a long-time agricultural critic, and he recognizes and realizes that there's a need to respond on many occasions with an industry that does require that kind of flexibility sometimes from season to season, year to year, sector to sector. So in some ways, it is a housekeeping piece of legislation, but I think it does go beyond that and does warrant some comments today. Because policies and programs are constantly evolving, because we know that, the face of agriculture just in the last decade, and especially as we've talked about in this House, many occasions, the need for a stronger local agricultural economy. And I say that in the strongest sense, because we know that for so many of our communities, and not too far, beyond the city boundaries, there are many communities that have a high degree of their jobs, their interests, and so on with agriculture. And in fact, all 18 counties of Nova Scotia have agricultural activity going on. So I think when we see from the beginnings of about a decade ago, the emergence of a local food economy, the growth, or first of all, the initiative of Select Nova Scotia, the growth of Select Nova Scotia, again, to be able to bring new initiatives to that development. This bill will again allow for the minister and the department to provide direction, signing off on policy and programs that can be supportive of a stronger local food economy. I think the potential of the buy local movement after just 5 years of a directive approach is making good headway in the province. We know that we still have a long way to go, and that's why our caucus proposed the idea of setting a target that by 2020, 20% of our food production and consumption would be locally produced. And in many ways, as we all know in this House, that's a return to something that we did decades ago. At the turn of the last century, the 20th century, we know that that agriculture was part and parcel of many rural families, and we certainly have departed from that to a point where just 13% of our food dollar is spent on locally grown and produced products. So we do have a ways to go. And in fact, as the centralization of our food into just a couple of major chains, in fact, we had a drop off just at the just around the year 2000 in the last probably in the previous decade, and so we now have a lot of catch up to do. On average, a lot of our food is traveling about 8,000 kilometers to arrive on our plate, and I think reversing that and tapping into the great potential of our province, and in particular some areas, the Annapolis Valley, Colchester, Cumberland, Antigonish, also on Cape Breton. The Bollitree area has outstanding agriculture currently being practiced, but I think as our local food economy continues to grow, Bollitree Island will play a stronger role in having a seasonal amount of food available. We have seen also a change just since I entered the legislature with two very, very important sectors of our agriculture, and that was the demise of the hog industry and the near collapse of the beef industry after BSC. So when the minister brings forth this bill, it is about being responsive around policies and programs that can address those kinds of concerns. So, and I believe those are two industries that again can have a better day in our province. The hog industry was built on cheap grains, and we now need to have initiatives that will see us growing, producing, drying grains for the hog industry. There is a demand for high quality, pork in the province. At one point, we had reached a plateau of around 57% of all of our pork being grown and produced locally. And now we're down to 10 producers in the province, and some of those 10 are actually on a relatively small scale, primarily meeting local smaller markets. So I think with the quality again of the genetics of our pork, hopefully we'll see some resurgence through the local markets, and we have a commitment from some of our local markets of 100% of their product that goes through their store is grown, produced here in Maritime Canada. So if we can get that kind, I guess, of pickup and support, then the agriculture industry has a tremendous opportunity to see some growth and be on a sustainable path. I know the The beef industry, again, is one that we heard from the Deputy Minister yesterday in public accounts that is receiving a lot of attention. And the commitment there to have, you know, I guess what can be done best in our province, looking at our climate, the production of a grass-fed beef product, and again, the demand for that. And it's made only too clear when we get incidents such as we've had in Western Canada, in Brooks, Alberta, around XL Foods. It was amazing in a market place near Berwick that's 100% committed to local product, and that is at the Jim Lamb's outlet. He said every other person was asking, where does your beef come from during that period there? And I think it highlights what the need that is out there, the market potential, because again, I can't find through any research when there was a problem around contamination in our local, provincially inspected abattoirs and plants. Because one of the things which distinguishes provincial inspection from federal is that a provincial inspector is on site every time there are animals in the plant to go through the kill process, whereas with federal inspection, the building meets federal requirements, but you don't necessarily have to have a federal inspector in place during all of the processes, and that's probably where some of the best practices around good cleaning, hygiene, and so forth is sometimes not followed. But I know in the wake, in the discussion, in the concern and suspicion around what could be, should be a very healthy product, I think it gives us again an opportunity to look at the production of local beef. And I know as this program moves along, hopefully this bill can in fact be an asset to the minister and to government to make any kinds of quick responses that indeed will be required. So just to kind of put that in perspective, we know that we only produce a small amount of beef in this province, but to put it on the scale of the requirement, if we produced all the beef we eat in the province, farm cash receipts could increase from 22.5 million to at least 90 million a year, and full year equivalent employment would increase from 448 jobs to about 1,700 jobs. So even if we can move part way along that pathway of the potential that is before us, and once again, and I do agree that you know, farmers have to make a living. Farmers have to have margins that provide an income for them and their family and their reinvestment in the farm. So if we can get, again, Atlantic Canadians to buy into maritime-produced beef, I think it can go a very, very long way to, again, one of the sectors where we see, you know, beef can be produced in every county of Nova Scotia. I just wanted to offer those few comments around two sectors of agriculture that I think we can have some significant rebound in, and I do applaud government's initiative around the grass-fed beef industry, and hopefully we'll continue to make progress, and we'll see that as a product on store shelves, and that will, and as long as we have choice, and I think Nova Scotians will respond very significantly towards what we produce ourselves. So, Mr. Speaker, we want to see this bill move forward to law amendments, and with those few words, I take my place.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in my place today and just take a few minutes on this bill, agriculture and marketing. And I would suggest that not unlike many other bills that go through this House in years past, amendments are needed from time to time to make them better, to add to them as we grow. In this case, pardon the pun, but as we grow and we learn that this was a bill that was actually very effective over the last 5 years. We've seen good growth in this with the buy local campaigns and the incredible suppers and dinners and whatever we're calling it now as we go around the province. They have been very successful. Certainly in my area, we see good turnouts. We see the agricultural industry involved in that and helping to support that. I know last year in Brooklyn we had a number of different farmers bringing their products in and donating them for this very supper. A very unique thing to see, something we'd not seen in the past. So that's all good, and as we continue and we make amendments, as I said, that are required to enhance the bill and make it stronger, if the minister needs more ability to create new policy, then so be it. We should be supporting that and giving that to him or her and to the government. The minister mentioned jobs and the millions of dollars in jobs that the farming industry puts forward each and every year in this province, and that's true, and we need to continue to grow that. So whatever we can do to grow that, but there's a lot in getting there. We've been a long time getting back to where we are now. We heard the member for Kings West talk about a plan to get to 20% by 2020. In my opinion, I'm not looking at 2020, I'm looking at sooner rather than later, and the more local that we can do, the better. We need to continue to work on that, and whether that's 20% or 25% and hopefully more than that. There are ways to make it happen. I spoke yesterday at length in public accounts with regards to the buy local piece, and that was a very good meeting actually. The Deputy Minister and others were here, and we talked about a number of things, and one of them was the labeling piece. How Nova Scotians are going to the store and seeing on labels packaged for said store, but not necessarily where the product is from. And as people begin to absorb and get the ability and want and desire to purchase locally, they're now picking up the jar and they're saying, where did it come from? Well, they don't know. But what's good and what's very interesting is they're calling and they're asking, why are those products not being labeled? You know, and there are a multitude of reasons, as we hear in public accounts yesterday. There are some complications, but that doesn't mean that that can't be done, can't be worked on, and we can't do better at that. That's one small piece when we really think about it. But people do want to know where their food is coming from. We've got a lot of room to improve that particular area, Mr. Speaker, and in doing so, and in being able to encourage people to buy local, if we can do another 30% in the next 5 years, that would be fabulous as well. You know, that would be A1. Actually, we would be much closer to the target. I've said in my place before here about educating our young people in the schools about what that means, instead of when you ask them, where do milk and eggs and so on come from, they say Sobeys or Superstore. Well, we all understand that. We've sort of got away from where we were maybe in the minister's young days. Maybe he worked in milk cows and done all the... He's quite a bit older, though, Mr. Speaker, than I am, as you're going to appreciate. Mr. Speaker, in all seriousness, so this wiser, he would claim, perhaps, yes. Mr. Speaker, this is a bill we're supporting. As I've said, we need to be able to have the ability to make this happen. We need to be able to grow our local economy, and that means growing jobs. And the farm industry, we know that is a huge economic driver in this province, and we need to see it grow even more. So the more that we can do to make that happen, as I mentioned briefly, you know, about different aspects of the labeling of our local products, such as beef and pork and all. It's much bigger than that, Mr. Speaker. If we need to create more processing opportunities in the province, and we should be looking at that. If that helps grow the beef and the pork, because we need to process it here and we can't, then let's look at enlarging that. Perhaps that's an area of concern that we should be addressing, and it may not be as hard as some people think. It's a want and a desire to do so, and I always find it interesting, especially in the last number of months here, government decides You know, we're going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in some, but not in all. And when we look at something as secure as what our farming industry has actually been, albeit has shrunk over the years, it is still a very, very large industry in the province of Nova Scotia. We should be looking at programs and investments in that industry that will carry it through the long term. So, Mr. Speaker, I won't take much more time than that, but I do want to thank the Minister for bringing the amendments forward that were needed, and that we would certainly be in support of this bill as it goes over to law amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. If I am to recognize the Minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable, the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to stand to close debate on this bill. I want to just thank the members opposite for their contribution. I just want to make it clear, this is not a buy local bill. And as much as it might seem like an odd thing, because I think it seemed like an odd thing to me when this was first brought to my attention, you would think that when somebody becomes a minister and a member of cabinet that he actually has certain authority to do some of the things that seem to be indicated in this amendment for this piece of legislation. But in people, people in the department doing their due diligence thought that this actual amendment should clarify that it's not entirely clear that the minister actually has that authority. So we're putting that authority in this piece of legislation. My colleague, the Minister of Fisheries, actually has similar authority in legislation that he oversees. And I guess the fact that so much of the staff works in both departments, that they found this and felt that this is an amendment that was necessary. So anyway, thanks. I want to thank the members opposite for their comments, and so I close debate on Bill. You want to give me a number? 105, and look forward to it going to law amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The motion before the House is for second reading of Bill number 105, the Agriculture and Marketing Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried.
Bill number 105, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 6 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Agriculture and Marketing Act.
I move that this bill now be sent to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable, the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, please call Bill number 107, Data Collection and Management Reform 2012 Act.
Bill number 107, the Debt Collection and Management Reform Act. The Honourable, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Premier for his comments. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 107 be now read a second time. It's a pleasure to begin debate on Bill 107, the Collection and Debt Management Reform Act, Reform 2012 Act. Mr. Speaker, the Collection and Debt Management Reform Act will protect Nova Scotians who are struggling to pay their debt by restricting aggressive marketing tactics and promises of unrealistic debt reductions. Mr. Speaker, credit and the ability to take on debt are a reality of life. And for the vast majority of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, big purchases like a home or a car or even an education would not be possible without some form of credit. And while no one plans to get into debt that they cannot repay, sometimes the unexpected happens and people find themselves struggling to repay creditors. So over the past several years, Mr. Speaker, debt management agencies, which include debt settlement companies, have become very active across Canada and here in Nova Scotia too. The new act amends the Collection Agencies Act and the Consumer Creditors Conduct Act and allows government to improve and update consumer protection around debt management agencies and collection agencies. They also allow government to put regulations in place that prohibit debt management agencies from charging upfront fees and caps the fees consumers can be charged by these companies. Debt management agencies will also need to get consumers to sign off on a settlement before they can collect their fees. Other changes specific to debt management include creating separate licenses for debt management agencies and the people who work for them, prohibiting unlicensed debt management agencies from operating in Nova Scotia, introducing new restrictions on false and misleading advertising, and renaming the Collections Agencies Act and the Collections and Debt Management Agencies Act to better reflect its increased scope and responsibility. We're also moving forward on the collection agency side of things, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia's rules governing debt collection practices aren't as current as those in other provinces. Our restrictions don't protect as many people, and they don't adequately address new technology like social media and text messaging. So we're doing the right thing by upgrading those rules. The new legislation prohibits collection agencies from calling the same number when the wrong person is reached or the debt is disputed. Limits collection agencies to 3 contacts in 7 days when the collector is working for the same creditor. Stops collection agencies from contacting employers except to get a debtor's business address, title, and to confirm employment, and for contracting a debtor's family or household, relatives, neighbors, friends, or acquaintances, except to get a home address or phone number, and prohibits publishing or threatening to publish a debtor's failure to pay. So, Mr. Speaker, all of these changes bring Nova Scotia's practices concerning collection and debt management agencies in line with those in other provinces, particularly Alberta and Ontario. So, Mr. Speaker, consumers have a moral, ethical, and legal obligation to repay their debts, and Mr. Speaker, creditors have the right to be paid back. The proposed changes strike a balance between the rights of consumers and creditors. There is no doubt that being in debt is stressful and confusing. Often people don't know where or to whom to turn to for help, especially when they're faced with companies promising to settle their debts for less than what they owe, or calls from overzealous collectors. It often becomes too much to handle. With these efforts, Mr. Speaker, government is making life better by ensuring Nova Scotians who need help managing their debt are treated respectfully and responsibly, do not pay upfront for services they don't receive, and that the rules around debt management agencies and collection agency practices are current and consistent province-wide. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my place, and I look forward to the contribution of the other members of the House. Thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize the Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of aspects of this bill mirror a bill that we Liberals have brought in on 2 previous occasions, Bill 127 last year, and again this spring, Bill 53. And our Debt Settlement Protection Act was crafted in consultation with the Credit Counselling Services of Atlantic Canada. Now, we have a few concerns about this bill. Overall, it's a good thing, but there are a lot of important pieces that have yet to be developed. As we often say, the devil is in the details. There's regulations, and we want to underline that the government should work very closely with those in reputable consumer protection and counseling service organizations to ensure that the regulations are the best they can possibly be. Our bill, the genesis of our bill came not this past summer, but the summer before, when we received news that, in fact, some unlicensed agencies were advertising in the province, and they weren't supposed to be operating in the province, but they were certainly advertising. And I did notice, because after I became sensitized to the issue, I did notice that if you're flicking around the channels and you get channels from other parts of the country, you would see advertisements on television for debt poolers. So if you didn't know that they had to be licensed in this province, you might call them up, for example, if you were a consumer and you were desperate. So you might end up with one of these debt poolers without realizing that's where you were going. And what was happening is people were giving debt poolers money for periods of time like 6 months, thinking that the debt poolers were in fact dealing with creditors and paying off bills, and they weren't. They were just taking the money. So a number of the provisions in this bill, like not being able to actually get a fee until you've actually performed the work, are very helpful, and we do appreciate that. We do have some concerns around commercial collectors. A lot of the commercial collectors, they're dealing business to business, and so they maintain that they don't engage in unscrupulous practices because business A may be doing business with business B next week again. So they're not going to be harassing or anything like that because they may have a business relationship and do work with them in the future. So they maintain that they would not engage in those kinds of practices, and they're quite upset. There was an article in the Herald, I'm sure many people saw it, where they were very clear that they were not happy being lumped in with debt poolers. And so I'm hoping that the government will listen to their comments. I expect that they will come to law amendments and actually take their comments to heart, and if there are appropriate amendments that should be made, they could do that then. I think, why this kind of a bill is necessary, though, is that for the average consumer, or even someone who is just desperate, and they may not be able to distinguish between a legitimate debt agency that would help people pay off their debts versus a debt pooler that is going to take their money and not follow through. So we do appreciate that, and as we often say, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And so for a lot of people, just being an educated consumer would be a lot of help. I would like to note that there are reputable organizations that we have worked with, and I'm sure the government has worked with as well, that do provide credit counseling to people who have gotten into debt. And as has been pointed out by the Governor of the Bank of Canada, household debt is a huge problem in this country, with many people in fact, Mark Carney told the Senate Banking Committee on Halloween that the levels of household debt to income are elevated to about 163%. So I think there are a lot of people who are concerned about debt or who ought to be concerned about debt. We do want to make sure that the government takes enforcement to heart. It's one thing to bring in a bill, but it's another thing to actually enforce it. And what we need to make sure that what happens here isn't what happened in Manitoba, where debt collectors were not being monitored and reported on as well as they could have been. And in fact, in Manitoba, they're supposed to publish the names, and that wasn't being done. They said the reason they weren't publishing the names of debt collectors that were getting into trouble was because all the cases actually were resolved, but I guess having that as a threat over their heads might help. So I think that one possible improvement that we would be looking for would be to add the differentiation between the business-to-business debt collectors versus the consumer debt collectors, and perhaps